At the dawn of the 20th century, the oceans became the ultimate theater for industrial supremacy. The romantic era of wood and canvas was dead, replaced by steam, coal, and the birth of the modern battleship. In this unprecedented arms race, warships were more than weapons, they were national souls forged in steel. Great Britain stamped out practical leviathans to police a global empire. Germany engineered mathematically precise killing machines. Russia launched lumbering iron fortresses to project raw imperial might. But France built something else entirely. Instead of austere instruments of destruction, they launched vessels that looked like floating cathedrals, unexpectedly set adrift. They possessed extreme tumblehome designs that bulged outward at the waterline and sloped sharply inward toward the deck, looking dangerously top-heavy. Rising from these strange foundations were chaotic silhouettes of massive, cylindrical military masts towering into the sky, alongside towering superstructures. Combined with traditional decorations, this radical engineering made them arguably the strangest warships ever constructed. To some, they were magnificent expressions of maritime majesty. To others, mechanical monstrosities. Yet, behind every chaotic silhouette lay a logical story. These vessels were not accidents or vanity projects. They represented a homegrown philosophy that briefly convinced Paris it possessed the most advanced fleet on Earth. Following a catastrophic defeat during the Franco-Prussian War in 1871, France was strategically isolated. Across the Channel sat the Royal Navy, an unstoppable juggernaut. The French Admiralty faced a cold reality: France could not match Great Britain ship for ship. The cost of trying to outbuild the British Empire was impossible. So, French naval thinkers chose to outthink them. Where the British valued standardization, building uniform classes of identical ships for predictable tactics, the French embraced a radically different dogma. They treated every capital ship as an independent, floating laboratory. This gave rise to the fleet of samples. Nearly every battleship laid down in French yards during the 1880s and 1890s was a unique, standalone design, engineered to improve upon the flaws of the one before it. Where Britain celebrated uniformity, France celebrated radical experimentation. The late 19th century was the height of the Belle Époque. French society placed immense cultural value on pushing the boundaries of art and engineering. The same republic that constructed soaring glass and iron railway stations viewed its bizarre navy through a lens of national pride. Warships were floating ambassadors. When one of these strange, towering battleships dropped anchor in a foreign harbor, it was expected to project the absolute pinnacle of French daring, innovation. Consequently, even though the age of sail had long since passed, many decorative traditions refused to die. French designers insisted on retaining beautiful stern galleries, elaborate windows, decorative carvings, and gilded trim. Unlike the increasingly austere, grey walls of British ships, French vessels retained an unmistakably aristocratic elegance. From the right angle, they resembled armored royal yachts. Only the menacing protrusion of heavy artillery betrayed their true, lethal purpose. However, the eccentricity of these ships ran far deeper than mere ornament and woodwork. The very hull forms beneath the decoration were built on engineering principles completely alien to the rest of the world. Chief among these was the extreme use of the tumblehome hull. In standard shipbuilding, a vessel's sides rise relatively straight up from the waterline, or even flare outward. In French design, the hull sides curved violently inward as they rose. This gave the ships a remarkably wide, stable beam at the waterline, but a very narrow, constricted upper deck. On paper, tumblehome was an architectural stroke of genius. It offered several theoretical advantages. Enemy shells striking the curved hull at steep angles were more likely to glance off harmlessly. The narrow upper deck presented a significantly smaller target for enemy gunners. By narrowing the superstructure, heavy main turrets mounted on the sides could fire directly forward and backward without blasting their own ship apart. It kept the heaviest parts of the upper hull concentrated closer to the ship's center line. In practice, however, tumblehome hid a fatal flaw. While it kept the ship stable during minor rolls, the inward-sloping sides drastically reduced the vessel's reserve buoyancy. If the ship took on water or rolled past a certain critical angle, the physics inverted dangerously. Instead of righting itself, the ship would capsize with terrifying speed. While other navies looked at these calculations and abandoned the concept, France embraced tumblehome with absolute devotion throughout the 1890s. Combined with their high forward decks and ornate sterns, it gave French capital ships a silhouette that was instantly recognizable anywhere on the globe. The towering military masts. If the hulls were strange, the structures rising above them were even more fantastical. Towering over the decks were the famous French military masts. These were not the slender wooden or steel poles used by other navies to fly flags or support signal lines. Instead, they were massive, hollow steel towers, built as part of the ship itself. They were fighting positions in their own right. Inside them were enclosed observation posts, advanced range-finding stations, powerful searchlights, signal rooms, and positions for light rapid-fire guns. From a distance, they looked less like naval equipment and more like the stone keeps of medieval castles rising from the sea. Combined with unusually tall funnels, designed to carry smoke well above the observation positions, these military masts gave French battleships a tall, top-heavy appearance. The silhouette was unlike anything built by any other navy. It became the defining feature of French battleship design. This philosophy of complete self-reliance extended directly to the ship's weapons. French naval architects believed in overwhelming firepower. But instead of relying on only a few giant guns, they believed a battleship should carry weapons for every possible threat. Heavy main guns were mounted in single turrets at the bow, the stern, and along the sides of the ship. Medium-caliber guns occupied their own armored turrets and casemates. Quick-firing guns lined the upper works, while the bridges and military masts carried light anti-torpedo guns and machine guns. The finished result looked almost chaotic. Barrels pointed in nearly every direction, giving the impression that the ship could fight enemies wherever they appeared. Yet this apparent chaos had a very practical purpose. During the late 19th century, the invention of the self-propelled Whitehead torpedo changed naval warfare forever. Suddenly, small and inexpensive torpedo boats could slip through the darkness and threaten even the largest battleships. The French response was simple. Build battleships that could defend themselves from every direction. Their ships became floating hedgehogs, surrounded by layers of rapid-fire guns. Any torpedo boat that ventured too close would face a storm of shells long before it reached firing range. To truly understand this remarkable period of naval design, it helps to look at the individual ships that defined it. The first was Charles Martel. With its dramatic tumblehome hull, towering forecastle, widely separated single-gun turrets, and richly decorated stern, it represented French naval ambitions in their purest form. Every angle revealed another unusual engineering decision. The result was a warship that looked both intimidating and strangely elegant. Next came Carnot, a ship that pushed the French style to its absolute limit. Its superstructure seemed to rise in layers, one level above another, almost like the terraces of a grand Parisian palace. It looked less like a conventional battleship and more like a floating fortress or luxury hotel. Foreign naval observers often struggled to describe its unusual, block-like silhouette. Then there was Jauréguiberry. Although slightly smaller and more compact than some of its sisters, it still displayed all the classic features of the French school. The graceful tumblehome hull, elegant overhanging stern, high freeboard, and remarkably complex arrangement of overlapping gun turrets combined to create another unmistakable example of French naval architecture. Each ship looked related, yet no two were identical. That was completely intentional. Every vessel tested a different armor layout, a different machinery configuration, or a different placement of the main battery. The French Navy genuinely believed that this process of relentless, iterative experimentation would eventually yield the perfect battleship. Instead, it produced one of history's most fascinating collections of unique warships, a fleet of individuals. When these ships sailed abroad, they turned heads and divided opinions. British officers often reacted with a mix of polite confusion and professional skepticism. Naval journals published biting cartoons exaggerating their top-heavy appearances. One British writer famously mocked them as architectural competitions masquerading as warships, while another compared them to floating hotels. Yet, behind the mockery, serious naval analysts admitted an uncomfortable truth. French engineering was world-class. France's Harvey and Krupp-style armor production was among the toughest in existence. Their artillery possessed exceptional muzzle velocity and range. Their multitubular boilers were highly advanced. The British criticisms focused almost entirely on the complexity and appearance of the hulls, never on the quality of the science within them. Floating symbols of France. In peacetime, these ships were magnificent instruments of soft power. Painted in their brilliant peacetime livery, pitch-black hulls, gleaming white superstructures, and rich buff-colored masts and funnels, they projected immense national confidence. When they entered a port, polished brass gleaming and the crew lined up perfectly along the narrow decks, they were the ultimate crowd pleasers. Citizens flocked to the waterfronts just to marvel at them. Newspapers celebrated every launch as a triumph of French industrial art. In an era before aircraft carriers or satellite communications, these battleships were the ultimate ambassadors. Their ability to awe and terrify was deemed just as vital as their performance in combat. Part 4. The problem with beauty. But while France celebrated its artistic and technical innovations, the reality of naval warfare was changing at a terrifying pace. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, naval guns grew larger, telescope sights improved, and effective engagement ranges opened up from a few hundred yards to several miles. Suddenly, the very features that made the French ship so distinctive became catastrophic liabilities. The towering, layered superstructures and massive military masts that had once awed foreign dignitaries were now just colossal, unmissable targets for high-explosive shells. The complex maze of mixed gun calibers made accurate fire control a mathematical nightmare, as spotters struggled to tell the splash of a 6-inch shell from that of a 12-inch shell. Slowly, reluctantly, even France realized the era of romantic extravagance had to end. With each successive class, the hulls became straighter, the superstructures cleaner, and the designs more practical. The floating palaces were beginning to fade. Then, in 1906, the hammer fell, and Great Britain launched HMS Dreadnought. With her uniform, big gun armament, revolutionary steam turbine propulsion, and clinical, devastatingly efficient layout, she rendered every single battleship on Earth obsolete overnight. The era of high-range, fast-moving, standardized fleet actions had arrived. Almost instantly, the magnificent, experimental ships that had represented the absolute zenith of French industrial pride looked like ancient relics from a forgotten century. The world had moved on, leaving the fleet of samples stranded in the past. Ending, yet their legacy endures. The French pre-dreadnoughts never won the decisive, world-shaping fleet actions their designers had envisioned. They never conclusively proved to the world that the French philosophy of individual experimentation was superior to standard mass production. History ultimately chose efficiency over artistry, cleanliness over complexity, and standardization over expression. But efficiency rarely captures the human imagination. More than a century later, photographs of these extraordinary vessels still stop historians and enthusiasts dead in their tracks. They stand out in sharp relief against the monotonous rows of identical grey warships that followed them. They were certainly not the most lethal. But no nation, before or since, ever possessed the sheer audacity to build battleships quite like France. From the gun decks to the bridge, every story we tell honors those who served. If this tale made you feel the salt and steel of history, give it a like, and if you're not yet part of our channel's convoy, subscribe and join the ranks. More powerful stories await.